Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our APORDE virtual alumni conference. This is our third edition of the APORDE Alumni Conference. And for those who don't know me, I'm Saul Levine from TIPS, and we provide support to the APORDE and IPPM program. This conference has the theme of industrial development in Africa. And the aim of this conference is to share ideas, knowledge, experiences in how we can collectively shape a better and more inclusive industrial development pathway for African countries. Everyone would have received the program for today, as well as the bios of our different speakers and presenters. And for those who've joined us previously, you will remember that the request for this conference came from the participants of APORDE and IPPM, who were looking for a platform to connect and interact with colleagues after those programs had come to an end, and it's a way of keeping alive the ideas and rich discussions that we have on both APORDE and IPPM. So as organizers, we happy to provide that platform, and we've opened it up to alumni from the program, as well as others who are interested in engaging with how we can improve Africa's economic development pathway. It's an opportunity for this conference to bring in people from APORDE and IPPM, as well as others who are interested in Africa's industrial development, to share not only research, but also practical insights and experiences in implementing industrial policy or industrial development programs that they've been working in. We've structured the program so that it covers both research and practitioner experiences. And you will see that from what we've shared in the program for this morning. We also encourage participants to engage on the presentations and also in the chat, so that we're sharing our knowledge with each other, and we contribute to deepening our understanding on the issues raised. So we've got a great program today, and in advance, thank you to all the presenters and speakers and people who submitted abstracts. I'm looking forward to the presentations and the insights that we'll get today. Also, just to note that we are celebrating 20 years of APORDE this year. I've personally been involved in the program since 2013, and I've seen the contribution that it's made in shaping our thinking. So it's great to be part of this and to contribute to what we have set out to do. Through the APORDE, IPPM and Alumni network, we're increasingly building a group of people across the continent who are thinking differently about economic development, the constraints we face, and the opportunities that exist. It gives hope towards more positive economic developments and across the continent at a time when there's so much global turmoil. And it's exciting to see that we have interest in what we're trying to do here, because it gives us as the African continent something to work towards and contribute towards. So I hope we have a very fruitful conversation today. I also want to acknowledge the support from the South African Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, who have been core supporters of the APORDE program. I will now like to invite our next speaker, Professor Fiona Tregener, to say a few words of welcome on behalf of the APORDE Scientific Committee. Professor Tregener is the director at the United Nations University in Maastricht, working on the Economic and Social Research Institute on Innovation and Technology, summarized to you and you merit. She's also the chair of the APORDE Scientific Committee, and previously she held the South African Department of Science and Innovation, National Research Foundation, South African Research Chair position in industrial development. Her research focuses on structural change, industrialization and deindustrialization, innovation and technological upgrading. Professor Tregener has been actively involved in work to promote economic development in Africa, and has served on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area Advisory Council and the South African Presidential Economic Advisory Council, as well as this G20 Africa panel. Over to you, Fiona. Thank you.
Thank you, Saul. Greetings to everybody and welcome to the 2026 APORDE Alumni Conference with the theme Industrial Development in Africa. I'm going to be brief so that we can hear from our two esteemed speakers and then to move on to the actual conference session, since we're here primarily to hear from and to engage with the presentations by the alumni themselves. Really delighted to see this conference having come together, the third of these conferences, and credit to Saul and the team for that. The conference makes a really important contribution to building this APORDE alumni network as a vibrant, living network of alumni of APORDE and IPPM, strengthening the links, sharing research, sharing connections and ideas and so on. This alumni network, as Saul said, it came from interest from the alumni themselves, as a key channel for maintaining and for strengthening the links among the alumni. As Saul said, APORDE has been running for 20 years now, which is in itself really phenomenal. So people who attended APORDE in the early years are now at a completely different stage of life and careers from when they attended and current participants. So this network includes alumni from many different countries, mainly, of course, across the continent, but also beyond, from different backgrounds, academic, policy, and more broadly, different levels of seniority in people's careers and so on. So it's really an opportunity to meet fellow alumni beyond the year in which someone actually attended APORDE and IPPM, add to professional networks and so on. Beyond the alumni network, this conference itself is important more broadly in terms of promoting and showcasing research on industrial development in Africa. And looking at the program for today, there's a real nice mix of interesting topics, including critical minerals, political economy of industrial policy, tech transfer and innovation. So really timely topics and research which has a strong relevance for policy, which is really pertinent given the growing emphasis on the importance of industrialization and industrial policy on our continent. In the spirit of APORDE, I would see this conference and the research which is being shared as part of Rethinking Development Economics. And it's really encouraging to see alumni actively rethinking and reimagining industrialization and development in Africa and providing valuable insights for policymakers. So I look forward to listening to the papers and discussions and to seeing the conference go from strength to strength in future. Without further ado, let me introduce our eminent speakers. Firstly, Zukiswa Khumani, who's the Chief Director in the Sectors Branch of South Africa's DTIC. She's coordinated, managed, evaluated and developed various iterations of South Africa's industrial policy, the IPAP, and has also worked on the Reimagined Industrial Strategy and the associated master plans. As part of her role in DTIC, she also manages research and industrial policy capacity building programs such as APORDE. She holds a master's degree in international development economics from the Australian National University. And yeah, I would really like to acknowledge the role of Zukiswa as a member of the APORDE Scientific Committee and a long-standing champion of APORDE, as well as, I'm not sure if she will mind me saying, it's one of our first and one of our most illustrious alumni. And then our keynote speaker, Emeritus Professor Faisal Ismail, who was until recently the director of the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at University of Cape Town. Also a long-standing lecturer and supporter of APORDE. He previously served as the Ambassador Permanent Representative of South Africa to the WTO and as South Africa's Special Envoy on the AGOA negotiations. Somebody that, if you think of someone who can really trace the history of South Africa's post-apartheid trade as a active leader in that, as well as in subsequent years as a player and an analyst. It would really be Faisal. He's also the author of 3 books on the WTO, as well as a book on the ACFTA, and more than 100 other publications on topics like trade, industrialization, climate change, and economic development. So a really great lineup, and followed by them, a great lineup of the alumni speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Sol and Fiona, for that introduction. Good morning, colleagues and participants. I think it gives me a great pleasure as an APORDE alumni to reflect on the role of government, in particular, I think the DTIC in industrial development. And I will want to situate my talk around South Africa's broader industrial policy agenda. As Sol and Fiona had reflected, the DTIC established APORDE around 2007, and it continues to support APORDE as a strategic intervention to strengthen policy capability in development economics and industrial policy, not only for South Africa, but for the Africa and the globe as a whole, as we do have participants from other regions. And I would say that from inception, APORDE has been conceived more than a training program. It is an investment in ideas, in people, and in institutions, recognizing that successful industrialization depends as much on analytical capacity and policy coherence as it does on incentives, regulations, and financing instruments. So therefore, design of industrial policy becomes key, and which is something that I think as South Africa, we are also trying to strengthen and improve. This approach is firmly aligned with the DTIC's mandate to lead industrial policy in South Africa. Through the national policy framework and successful industrial policy action plans, government has consistently emphasized the need for structural transformation, diversification of the productive base, and the expansion of value-adding employment intensive activities. And these objectives require an active, capable developmental state that is able to design, implement, and adapt industrial policy in a complex and rapidly changing global environment. Currently, we have a turmoil in our hands globally, where we are seeing the US, Iran, Israel, a turmoil that will have an impact on our industrial development initiatives. We are also witnessing technological transitions and green transitions that are forcing or compelling developing countries to have industrial policies that are able to respond to these transitions. APORDE directly supports this mandate by strengthening the intellectual foundations of industrial policy. As I think Fiona has indicated, it exposes us as policymakers, researchers that are on this call, and practitioners to evidence-based approaches to development economics grounded in historical experience and contemporary realities. It also encourages critical thinking and promotes policy thinking that is responsive to the specific conditions of our developing countries, in particular in Africa. And most importantly, I think it reinforces the principles that underpin South Africa's industrial policy framework, that industrialization is achievable, that markets alone are insufficient to drive structural change, and that strategic coordination between the state the private sector and society is essential, which is a practice that we've adopted through our master plans, where we adopted a practice of social compacting. Therefore, APORDE helps participants to understand not only what has worked elsewhere, but why it worked, and how policy instruments must be adapted rather than copied to suit our own individual conditions. For the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, APORDE complements the more direct instruments of industrial policy that we use in our industrial policy frameworks, such as the localization initiatives, sectoral master plans, trade measures, and industrial financing, by strengthening the human and institutional capabilities that make these instruments effective. So, in a way, APORDE is part of the instruments of industrial policy, where we're looking to build the skills, the analytical depth, and policy judgment required to translate frameworks and action plans into real economic outcomes, which is what we are continuously doing with our industrial policy. At a continental level, APORDE, it reflects South Africa's commitment to African-led development thinking. By supporting a network of African policymakers and scholars, the program contributes to a shared understanding of industrialization challenges and opportunities, and strengthens cooperation in support of regional and continental industrial development agendas. Therefore, the development of regional value chain has become more urgent than before. A crisis such as COVID and the current turmoil, they're really pointing us to the need to strengthen regional value chains within the continent, so that we can begin to trade with one another, and to also begin to invest and develop each other's economy through common industrial development policies. Therefore, in conclusion, the DTI's role in APORDE is an expression of our long-term vision that sustainable industrial development, it depends on capable states, informed policy choices, and continuous learning. By investing in people and ideas through APORDE, the DTIC is helping to lay the foundations for more effective industrial policy, stronger institutions, and inclusive growth in South Africa and across the continent. I would like to thank TIPS for organizing this platform to share ideas on industrial development in our continent, and I would like to wish all the participants a good deliberation today, and I want to thank you.
Thanks, Zukiswa. Faisal, over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, well, such a great pleasure, and really for me an honor to be part of the proceedings today. And I want to really thank Dr. Saul Levine, who's really been a stalwart in holding this together for almost 20 years now, and also Zukiswa Kimani, who's been acknowledged really for your sterling efforts in providing support to this program. I have been a part of the program for several years, and it has been one of the highlights of the year really for me to participate together with such amazing people from across the continent like yourselves, who are not only interested in ideas and the theory, but also are deeply involved in practice across the African continent in the processes of transformation. It's a great pleasure to see Professor Fiona Tregena in her new role. Congratulations to you, Fiona, for taking up this position in the United Nations in Maastricht, where I'm sure you will be doing an outstanding job furthering the work that you have been doing in South Africa and on the African continent. And with us today is also, I think, Dr. Adeyemi Dibiulu. I want to recognize them as being members of the Advisory Council on Trade and Industrial Development that was constituted a few years ago by the Secretary General of the AFCFTA, Wamkele Mene. So I'm speaking here today partly as the convener of that advisory council. It's a real great opportunity to be working together with such amazing people who are contributing their ideas at a time when the world is going through not just a turmoil, but a real rupture in global governance as we see a collapse of the rules-based system. And African countries have been left on their own as not just the rules, but also the support that they were once provided by the North has diminished and declined. And in this context, Africa has had to think about how does it move forward and how does it take advantage of this crisis and see it as an opportunity for the transformation of the African continent. So today I'm going to speak about this opportunity and how African countries can exercise their agency in driving a process of industrial transformation and regional economic integration. So I'm going to say a few things. So next slide, about the background to the AFCFTA, and then we'll say a few things about the theory that informs our ideas on regional economic integration and industrialization. And I will present to you a few thoughts I had about an approach to regional economic integration, which foregrounds and centers industrial development as the main driver of implementation of the AFCFTA. And then I'll say a few things about the way forward. So many people have asked, why is it necessary for the continent to industrialize? And one of the main reasons for that has been the need to address the challenge of competitiveness by countries and economies that are really too small. The African continent is made up of about 54, 55 spaces, and 33 of these economies are least developed, 6 are small island developing states, and 16 are landlocked developing countries. And so there has been a literature, an academic literature. Interestingly, a guy who worked for the World Bank, John Page, and at Brookings, wrote a number of papers. About 30 years ago already, John Page was arguing that the main approach that African countries should take to build their competitiveness is to cooperate and work together in a regional framework so that they could advance their transformation and build their competitiveness. So this was John Page, and I had the pleasure of speaking to people at a World Bank conference recently, and I wanted to acknowledge the work that John Page had done. It was ironic that I was at this conference, and it was the first time ever that the World Bank organized a conference in Africa with the title Industrial Development. It does point to a new opportunity that has emerged as institutions like the World Bank, who didn't want to really advance explicitly anyway industrial policy, have now come to recognize industrial policy as a valid and legitimate instrument for economic transformation. So what is the history of regional integration on the African continent? It goes beyond, of course, this argument of John Page. The Pan-Africanist thinkers, and here I speak about people like Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president, the first leader of an independent Ghana way back in 1957. As countries began to decolonize, the Pan-Africanist thinkers, those who were in exile, were coming back home, and they brought with them this idea of integration and unity of the African continent. So it was a vision. It was based on a political understanding by African leaders that Africa was colonized in the past. Many of the borders were, created and drawn in London or in Paris or in Berlin, and they needed to come together, unite, and rebuild their economies. But there was a guy called Adebayo Adedeji, a great thinker, an economist who was based in Nigeria. He came up with the idea that the continent should advance a project of regional integration based a bit on the ideas of Jacob Weiner, an economic theorist on regional integration, who proposed a linear process of moving from one stage to another, preferential trade to free trade, to customs union, and then common market. And Adedeji thought that a way forward for the continent would be to do this at a sub-regional level, because he recognized the continent was too large, it was too huge a project. So he proposed this in a document called the Lagos Charter in 1975, and then developed it further in 1980. And then in 1991, the OAU adopted it, and it became known as the Abuja Treaty. So the Abuja Treaty is still alive. It is part of the documentation that informs the African Union, and it inspired the AFCFTA. But of course, in that period of the 80s and the 90s, African countries were faced with a lot of crises. Some of those were caused by policies that the World Bank was advocating of structural adjustment. Their situation got worse as they, implemented these structural adjustment policies of rapid liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. So this was not a good period for regional integration. But of course, the early period of the 21st century created new conditions for African countries to grow. And by 2015, the African countries based in the South, in SADC, EAC, and COMESA, these three regions came together, and leaders from there thought, well, why don't we embark upon a project of regional integration? And they were, at that point, they had already created a trilateral free trade agreement between these three blocks, and they joined forces with the West, with ECOWAS, and they launched a continental free trade negotiation. So it took a long time for the ideas of Adedeji to actually be implemented on the African continent. But this journey started in earnest in 2015, where the regional or sub-regional formations, the RECs, now could be all integrated together into one platform, a free trade agreement for the whole continent, launched in Johannesburg. And within 3 years, they were able to bring together the whole continent into a common framework And this framework was the African Continental Free Trade Area. This framework was launched in Kigali on the 21st of March. It was a historic occasion. It was the first time ever the continent had agreed to a protocol on trade in goods, a protocol on services, and a dispute settlement system. So these three protocols became the first framework for a free trade agreement that would stretch right across the African continent, incorporating all 55 member states. And the agreement came into force in 2019 as 22 members had signed on to the treaty. The treaty was ratified, and except for Eritrea, all 54 countries have signed the agreement, have ratified it, and it came into force. It was to be implemented on the 1st of July 2020, but you may recall that that was the middle of COVID. So we then we began the implementation on the 1st of January 2021. And the agreement was then in force. The Secretary General was appointed by the African Union. That's Wamkele Mene. An office was created and in fact provided by the government of Ghana in Accra, and the AFCFTA then came into being. So recently, the Secretary General said that the aims of the AFCFTA is to unite all 55 member states, representing over 1.5 billion people, with a combined GDP of over $3 trillion into a single integrated market for goods, services, investment, and the movement of people. So as I was saying, the scope of the AFCFTA, we have, by 2021, we had completed the first phase. There were a few outstanding issues that we still had to negotiate on the rules of origin for textiles and autos in the protocol on trade in goods. But that was substantially done, and it has now been almost fully completed. And we started negotiations on phase 2, which were to build rules on investment, competition, digital trade, intellectual property, and very interestingly, the first time, I think, in any trade agreement in the world, a protocol on women and trade. And this, signifies the real importance that the African countries place on inclusion, on the need to ensure that this AFCFTA is not just any trade agreement, but it does strive to include all people, including those who are on the margins of our economies and society. Now, the key question that we have to ask is, how can we ensure that the causes of the crisis we have seen in global governance and in globalization and in free trade agreements around the world, particularly in the North, in Europe, where you had, something called Brexit, where the British withdrew from the European Union, and of course, in the United States, where you've had a shift to the right of increased protectionism caused by a populist, movement, which stems from people who've been marginalized because they lost their jobs as globalization, caused factories to close in the Midwest, in many parts of the United States. And this created a momentum against free trade. So today in the world, the biggest economies, the most advanced economies, do not support free trade. They are in favor of a protectionism, which has also taken other forms of illiberalism and populism in these countries. How can we in Africa, as we embark on this amazing journey of implementing this free trade agreement, how can we avoid these catastrophes we are seeing in other parts of the world, particularly in the North? And here, this was what was obsessing me. And I was thinking about how we can build a narrative and a set of ideas that can inform the thinking about the implementation of the AFCFTA in a way that would avoid these mistakes in policy and would find a pathway that would succeed in building a prosperous and transformative regional integration process. And when I looked at the literature, what I found was that there was indeed a critique, as many of you who are students of industrial policy and heterodox economics, you will know that people like Harjun Chang and Robert Wade and recently Mazzucato and others have critiqued this idea of free trade, and they have proposed other approaches, heterodox approaches to economic integration and transformation. And at the heart of this is the need to change the basic philosophical foundations of integration. So instead of the approaches of mercantilism, where each country drives its own national interest to the exclusion of other interests, we need to change the values to those of solidarity, or as Nelson Mandela and other African countries know, the concept of Ubuntu, where this becomes an underlying value system. And indeed, even in Europe, the early founders like Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet, they built the foundations of the European project on this idea of solidarity. Of course, these days they have been forgotten. But in Africa, that should be our starting point, the concept of Ubuntu and solidarity. So working on that, I began to develop 4 pillars, which I argue should move in parallel. As we integrate the continent, we should advance each of these 4 pillars in parallel. And the first pillar I call fair trade, equity, and inclusiveness. And in this pillar, I argue that we need to ensure that the way in which we implement the AFCFTA should be inclusive. We should ensure that we create opportunities for all stakeholders to participate, but we should also ensure that the substance of the agreement is inclusive. In other words, the economic and social impact of the agreement should ensure that it empowers the marginalized. It includes the marginalized. Groups like women and youth should be actively drawn into the mechanics of the institution. But also, there should be a recognition that we are not the same. As I said, in Africa, we have 33 LDCs. Some are, small island states, some are landlocked. We need to recognize difference in levels of development, and we need to provide the necessary flexibility for those countries that need more time, that may need more assistance to implement the agreement. And then we also need to make sure that the private sector that's involved in the process contributes in a way which helps to build capacity wherever they go. It should not be a situation where multinational companies from different, hegemons on the continent, like South Africa, our multinationals moving across, whether they're retailers or they're banks, or manufacturing companies, processing companies, they should be building supplier capacity wherever they are. They should be drawing on local capabilities, helping to support through technology transfer, through capacity building. And in that way, they will be assisting to build local ownership and also contributing to industrial development. And I have a number of case studies that I have done, like the Woolwood study, and I've written about it, and you can look it up. The second and very important area or pillar I call transformative industrialization. Now, whilst trade integration generally has been understood around the world as a process that opens markets and creates opportunities for companies, the real driver of trade integration that will ensure that the benefits of trade are dispersed more widely is transformative industrialization. Most countries on the African continent cannot compete in the world economy on their own with their small markets. They need to cooperate. They need to work together, and they need to build regional industrial value chains. And in that way, they will be able to trade with each other in higher value added commodities, in intermediate goods. And in this way, we will be able as a continent to build the competitiveness of different industrial sectors, whether it's cotton, textiles, and apparel, where we're doing quite a lot of work now, and I'll say a few words about that, or in the automotive sector, where we can build value chains or supply chains across the continent and then build, vehicles and components that can compete globally. So the integration project, in other words, should be investment and production-led, not just trade-led, but investment and production-led. The regulations that we need to put in place at a national and at a regional level should support industrial development. It shouldn't impede and restrict the movement of goods. Neither should it impede and restrict industrialization, but they should be supportive. So I have also written a paper, or several papers actually, on the rules of origin and how the rules of origin can be a instrument that supports industrialization rather than impedes it. And then finally, of course, we have to ensure at a time when climate change is, heating up the world and wrecking, creating havoc in many of our countries, we need to ensure that climate resilient policies are put in place and mainstreamed in our industrial policy and economic strategy and in the regional integration project. So that is also a topic which I know is going to be discussed today, and I'm looking forward to that. Now, just to give you a few ideas about how we could build regional industrial value chains, we have the example and a case study that many of you, I hope, can also participate in doing the research and reflecting on. We are building a regional industrial value chain in the cotton, textile, apparel, and retail sector. It's taken us about 2.5 years. Our members, the Advisory Council, they've been participants in, convening private sector discussions from across Africa, from Mauritius, Madagascar, South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Morocco, and Egypt. So right across the continent, the private sector in each segment of the value chain, in cotton, textiles, apparel, and retail, they have been working. We've created working groups, and these working groups have been discussing the challenges and exploring policies to address those challenges. And we are now, I am hopeful that on the 17th of May, we will be launching this regional industrial value chain in Togo. So there is a literature on this. I've written a paper, so I won't talk about it now because we don't have time. I have said a few things in that paper about some of these issues that we have uncovered in the research from the private sector about how they understand the challenges for industrial policy. And we need to develop more coherent regional industrial policies to address these challenges. And again, this will be a discussion that we will hold in Togo when the private sector comes together to launch their regional industrial value chain. And then the third pillar I want to say a few things about is infrastructure. So trade integration cannot succeed in Africa if we don't put in place the instruments to build cross-border infrastructure, whether that's road, rail, and port. These all are necessary to both facilitate trade, but also to support processes of industrialization. And they need to go together so that the corridors that we build, these regional, industrial infrastructure projects, they need to be coordinated with each other so that along these corridors, we are able to build industrial projects, value addition in mining, in agriculture, that can then make the corridors viable, profitable, and successful. There are many examples of where we are succeeding, and we were involved in one of those, the Maputo corridor, which has been very successful in its first phase. It's moving into second and its third phase. And in other parts of the continent, there are very ambitious projects, and I speak of the, say, Abidjan-Lagos corridor, bringing together about 16 countries, on the west coast of Africa, and others. And then the fourth important pillar is the concept of governance and democratic participation and peace. Without these, the integration project will not succeed. And often in the literature, we've got the sequence wrong or the emphasis wrong. A lot of the time in the literature from the North, they have placed emphasis on building institutions of governance without the necessary development underpinnings for democracy. But sometimes we focus only on economic development and not enough on democratic institutions that will ensure that the economic development project is sustainable in the long run. So we need both to move together, development and governance. It's like chicken and the egg. So this is the analogy that was used by none other than Mwalimu Nyerere, a famous and very revered leader from Tanzania, when he said democracy and development are like chicken and egg. Both of them are needed, and without the one, you won't get the fruits of the other. Okay, so what is the way forward? The way forward is really bringing together all four pillars: fair trade, which is inclusive, industrial transformation, cross-border infrastructure, and deepening democracy and participation. Moving together, we can implement the AFCFTA, bringing all 55 countries together, creating a virtuous circle of regional economic integration, transformation, and development. So the first step we're going to take, the big step of launching the first regional industrial value chain, will be in Togo, in Lomé, Togo, on the 17th of May this year. And I hope many of you are going to be able to participate. It's a business forum, the Biashara of the AFCFTA. It's the third one that will be hosted by the AFCFTA, and it will be a place for businesses from different industrial sectors to meet and to discuss how to move the project forward. And finally, I'd like to say that this vision of industrial development, it is something that the leaders of the African continent are seized with. So at their last meeting, which was just a few weeks ago, between the 11th of February and the 15th of February, there was a summit in Addis Ababa of the African Union. And during that summit, a committee was created by the presidents, the Committee of Heads of State and Government, on the implementation of the AFCFTA. So they are seized with, working together to implement the AFCFTA. But what was very important was that they all agreed that one of the important instruments to drive implementation should be industrialization and the building of industrial value chains. And this is why they made a request, or they instructed the AFCFTA to develop an AFCFTA industrial development protocol. So as the advisory council of the AFCFTA, we really are privileged to have this opportunity to work together with the Secretariat to begin to think about the mechanics or the framework document and the instruments of industrial policy that will be relevant and useful to build industrial value chains on the African continent and to advance the project of industrial transformation. So I want to thank you very much for listening to me. I hope I haven't gone over time. I leave some of my references there so you can follow some of the ideas that I've been putting forward. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Faisal. I think that was really a good way to start our conference, and it gives us lots of insights and connects some of the important issues that we've been talking about. This first session has come to an end, so I'd like to thank Fiona, Zukiswa and Faisal for their insights and contribution. I'm now going to hand over to Rex Asiyama, who's going to be the moderator for the next session. Over to you, Rex. Thank you.